Noswaith dda, a chroeso i'r digwyddiad Crime Cymru Festival hwn. Good evening, welcome to this Crime Cymru Festival. I'm Alice Hawkins, Festival Chair, and as this is the culminating event of our festival, I just thought I'd pop up to say hello, thank you for joining us, and to welcome Nell, Pattison and Batchelor, who are going to be discussing disability in crime fiction and talking about why representation is so important. So over to you two ladies.
Thank you. I'll start then. Hi, I'm Nell Pattison. I have written 5 different books. I do a little bit of police procedural and a little bit of psychological thriller. So I have a series, the Silent series, featuring Paige Northwood, who is a British Sign Language interpreter, who is involved in supporting the police when there are crimes involving members of the deaf community. And also 2 psychological thrillers called Hide and Friends Don't Lie. I've got 4 out of 5 next to me. We were just discussing this before we came on. I realised I've not got the 4th one. Not got Hide in there. Right, I'll pass over to Penny.
Hello, thanks for having me. I'm sorry, I don't really know any Welsh. I should have prepped, shouldn't I? That's most remiss of me. Yes, I'm Penny Batchelor, and I'm very delighted to be here. I've had 2 psychological thrillers published. They are My Perfect Sister and Her New Best Friend. They were published in 2020 and 2021, but I've got the honour of them having them republished with a different publisher, a much bigger publisher, Embla, which is part of Bonnier Books, at the end of this week. And Her New Best Friend is going to be republished, I should say, with a lovely new cover next month. And as well as the paperback, there's the ebook, and I'm going to have audiobooks as well for the first time, which I'm very excited about. And I'm also contracted to write 2 more thrillers, which I'm busily writing away doing, and I got about 200 words just before I started doing this festival. Now, it's a crime festival. That's why we're here. What is it that you love about writing crime?
Well, I didn't actually start off writing crime. My first few novels that I wrote were sci-fi. Not because I sat down and intended to write sci-fi, but because I wrote an idea that was in my head and it happened to be set in the future. And so someone said to me, well, that's sci-fi. And I kind of pigeonholed myself in my mind as a sci-fi writer. So I wrote quite a few sci-fi novels and completely failed to get anywhere regarding publishing. And then I had a bit of a break and I sat back and I looked at my bookshelves and I realised that the majority of what I read is crime. So I thought, well, maybe I'll try writing a crime novel. So that's how I've actually come into writing it. But I've always loved to read crime. It's always been one of my favourites. When I was growing up, we had a very small village library that was half of a porter cabin. The doctor's was the other half.
Same here.
And
porter cabin too.
Pardon? We had
our nearest library was a porter cabin too.
Maybe that was just how they did it in the 80s and 90s, porter cabin libraries. It was great, and our local librarian was lovely. She was wonderful. She had so much knowledge about books. Even such a small library, she made sure it was really quite eclectic. And I know that I exhausted like the Nancy Drews pretty quickly, and then she moved me on to Agatha Christie when I was probably about 12, and so I think that's where my love of crime has come from. And for me, it's the puzzle. It's having a puzzle to solve. Until I started writing crime, I was never very good at guessing it. I could forget who it was. Now I'm a bit better because I kind of know some of the tricks of the trade, and some of the ways that you might foreshadow things and some of the red herrings that you might drop in. So it's not quite got the same kind of surprise element at the end, but still there's still quite a lot of authors who still fool me. So how about you, Penny?
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned Agatha Christie, because I think that's something that a lot of crime writers have got in common. I've always read quite widely. I was a child. I loved the sort of Secret 7, Famous 5, that kind of very sort of little mysteries that they solved. And then I moved on to Agatha Christie. As a family, we always used to go down to Bournemouth for all our holidays because my parents had a caravan there. And on the seafront, there'd be these bookstores where there's sort of one of those twirly things with books. So my dad would go and say, you know, choose a book that you can read on the beach. And once I'd got past children's books, it was Agatha Christie's, and I was just completely hooked. They're very well written because they're very accessible, aren't they? Accessible to read, but so fiendishly clever. But actually getting round to writing crime, like you, I kind of fell into it. I got to my 40th birthday and I decided that I was really wanting to give writing a novel my best shot, because I'd written lots of ideas, lots of a few chapters, but done that really rookie mistake of saying I want to be a writer, but never actually finishing anything. And actually when we moved house, my husband and I looked back and I found these big red hardback notebooks where I'd written lots of things in, and I was just so embarrassed. I just thought I never want anybody to read this load of tosh. I was trying to write rom-coms at the time. I hadn't found my style. It was all very kind of pastiche. So that all went in the recycling, to the great recycling bin in the sky. But what I was quite interested in then, I really liked reading psychological thrillers, but I like reading historical fiction as well. And the course that I decided to do was a 6 months Faber Academy online writing a novel course, where you'd sort of learn the basics that you need to know. You'd learn about the industry. You'd have sessions just about every week in the group where you could feedback on everybody and support each other and work out where you were going wrong and where you were going right. And you'd end up with 15,000 words. And to get on this course, you had to submit the first chapter of a novel. I suppose it was just to check that you weren't absolutely terrible and going to be wasting your money and needed to start with more of a beginner course. So I sent in this first chapter of this Tudor novel. But the specification of the course, because I got a place, which I was very excited about, was that you couldn't work on the novel that you had already written the first chapter for. It had to be something different. And I'd had this idea that was sort of in my mind. I don't know about you, Nell, but have you ever you have an idea and you sort of park it in your brain, and then you hear something else, or it sparks another idea, and then it builds up layer by layer. And
Yeah,
so
both of my two psychological thrillers are ones that I had the initial idea for quite a long time ago, and both of them had kind of prototype versions before I wrote the versions that became the published ones. So yes, I do. I think sometimes we do need to have, when we have the spark of an idea, we do need to leave it to develop over time. You know, it's like a good wine. It needs time.
And so I got this idea because I'm very nosy, and I like people watching and working out why people do things. And so I had this idea of a woman who doesn't act in the way that society would expect her to. And I had this picture in my head that when she was a child, her eldest sister went to school one day and didn't come home, and nobody knew what had happened to her. But instead of grieving for it, she's actually quite angry because she was 5 when her sister was 16 and went missing. She couldn't really remember that very well, and she felt that her whole childhood was overshadowed by the family grief of this happening, and that there were these photographs everywhere of this sister who could do no wrong because she wasn't there. And so the main character, who I called Annie, just always felt that she couldn't live up to this. I guess you could say she got a big chip on her shoulder, that circumstances came together that she had to go back to her childhood home. And I just have this vision of her mother having kept the sister's room, Miss Havisham-like, exactly the same as it had been left just waiting for that daughter to come back home. And so,
was that in your first chapter then? Was that your first chapter that you submitted then about that room?
I think it's in the first
Yeah.
chapter, yeah. And so that's the idea that I started off with, and then it became my first novel, My Perfect Sister. But I'm so interested. I do like reading police procedurals and things like that, but I'm not a police officer. And I'm firstly a bit lazy to do all the research. I don't think I could probably do it as well as former police officers who write and do it brilliantly. But I'm just more interested in ordinary people who are put in extraordinary situations and who might never test themselves and find out what they're capable of. I did a talk at the local university a few weeks ago, and I said to the audience, if you were on a ferry and it was sinking, do you think that you'd run off and save yourself first, or would you be the sort of person who tried to get everybody else off and then helped yourself? And some people were quite honest. They actually said, yep, first off, that's me. But that's the sort of situation that we like to think that we would do the right thing. You want to think that we're moral, honest, kind people. But when people are put in a really tricky, difficult situation, would we actually do that? And those are the sort of questions that I like exploring in my novels, along with the idea, the whole Shakespearean idea of having a fatal flaw, that we have something in our personality that if it's tested is our downfall. And we might start going down a long road of making a few bad decisions, but then still going down that road, trying to turn back and cover up what we've done until we end up actually so far down that road, we just can't go back. So these are the sort of questions that I really like exploring in my books.
Yeah, I think it is interesting. I think writing crime gives you that opportunity to delve into, as you say, some of the worst of humanity and some of the mistakes and some of the situations that we all hope that we never face. But yeah, it does give you a bit of a chance to play with those sort of things and to I think sometimes as well it's nice to write a really nasty character.
Yes.
Yeah. I have some that are particularly nasty. Yes. Yeah, true. Although sometimes they don't get not enough, which it can be quite unsatisfying as a reader. But yeah, I think it's always an interesting one. So tell us about your most recent book then.
Well, my most recent book is called Her New Best Friend, and that is based upon the premise of how well do you actually know your friends when you've made a new friend? Because it's not that easy as a grown-up, is it? It's not like when you're at school or wherever, or you just you can spend all day with somebody and you sort of can get on really well. And that sparked my idea for my second book, which I can't tell you much about other than just read it, because I don't want to give all the plot twists away. But it's got lots of themes like motherhood and friendship and relationships, things like that. And it also has a couple of disabled characters in, which is, I guess, where we get to the nub of this talk, because both Nell and I have some sort of disability or chronic illness, and we both really feel that it's important that these are represented in our novels. I mean, I would say, according to the charity scope, about 20, I think it's just recently gone up to 21% of the population have some sort of disability, but you just don't see them in fiction unless the story is absolutely about that disability. So it might be the sort of tropes that I personally make me just want to cringe and crawl into a small hole to get away from. But the idea that somebody is having to overcome their disability because they're just not good enough the way they are, or somebody is miraculously cured, or that the sort of misery memoirs that everything is dreadful and being disabled is just completely awful and nobody wants to be that way, sort of thing. So I just wanted to make sure that my books just had ordinary people in, and that disabled people were part of that. And perhaps with the representation of them, if you don't have a disability, you might learn something, but it's not actually about that disability. They're just getting on with their lives the same way that we all do. And also they don't have to be perfect as well. They can be flawed individuals, because we're all human. We've all got our pros and our cons. We've all got our strengths and our weaknesses, and we all won't necessarily get on with each other. So how about you, Nell?
Yeah, well, with all of my books, all of my books feature deaf characters. I worked as a teacher working with deaf children for a long time, for 15 years, and the majority of the children I work with use BSL, either as their first language, or they use a form of sign language in order to help them access their education. And with my first few books, I wanted to make sure there was a deaf community portrayed in fiction, because there's only one book that I've come across, certainly in the crime genre before mine, that actually features a deaf community. There are books that have deaf characters, kind of sole individual deaf characters, but they don't seem to have other deaf people that they interact with. They don't necessarily have deaf friends or deaf family, or that sort of community that they are engaged with. And that is the case for some deaf people. Some deaf people, if they're born in hearing families and go to a school with majority hearing people, then it might be that all of their friends and family are hearing, and they don't necessarily have the access to that community. Though I think now, with the internet and social media, more young people are using the internet to access different communities of people that they identify with. So it does mean there's maybe more of a deaf community amongst young deaf people who maybe don't have them nearby, but can interact with people via the internet. But I wanted to show a deaf community that was a wide variety of deaf people. As like you, there are always tropes that are really irritating. I always say my pet hate is the one where someone's brought in to lip read a really grainy CCTV recording, which yes, on this recording where sometimes you can only see like half of the person's face, and it's like you don't know what language they're speaking, you don't know the context at all of what they're talking about. The CCTV might be from a really weird angle, so you can't see their face properly. It's stilted. There's no way you can tell what that person's saying. And there's a person who's been brought into lip read going, "Oh yes, they're gonna rob the bank on Wednesday at 7 o'clock." Which bank? Or the one of Yeah, and it just is. It's a little bit of a, and that goes back to your sort of like your magic disabled person trope. It's like, oh look, your disability gives you a magic power, oh how helpful you are, but that's it, that's your entire role in the story. And so
interjecting into that, sorry to interrupt, but I have seen books where perhaps if somebody is blind, they've got sort of super hearing or some amazing other senses to make up for it, or somebody's deaf, then they're they can see much further than other people or whatever, and it's just not realistic.
Yeah, again, it's suggesting that you have to be extraordinary in order to like make up for your disability or chronic illness or whatever. And so as I say, with my first three, so that's The Silent House, Silent Night, and The Silent Suspect, I wanted to have a deaf community to show that there's such a wide variety of deaf people from all walks of life, from all kind of levels of education, all different ethnic backgrounds and religious backgrounds, and from different geographical communities, the same as every other community. There's such a wide mix of people, such a wide range. I wanted to show that as the deaf community as a microcosm of the global community. But then with Hyde, I had a different kind of deaf character. So somebody who has grown up using bilateral cochlear implants, speaking rather than signing, who's had, quite a lot of negative experiences because of how people treated her because of her deafness. But she is a very different person from a lot of the characters in my first three. And then in my most recent one, Friends Don't Lie, way there. Izzy, there are two characters with the same name in Friends Don't Lie, and that's kind of one of the main premises of the plot. And so Izzy, who's one of those, she has a mild to moderate hearing loss, which is at the stage where it does cause her some anxiety and it does cause some problems in her life, but really it's not such a major thing, and it doesn't affect the plot whatsoever. Her hearing loss is nothing to do with the plot, and actually hers is most like mine. So there are some elements of my own kind of experience of losing my hearing that you can kind of find there in Izzy. Although I will point out that most of Izzy's personality is not me. Just especially if you read it, don't start, thinking I'm like Izzy. I promise I'm not. So yeah, that's it. And I wanted to try and have that. It's not necessarily positive representation in the sense of a positive character. It's genuine representation. That's what we're looking for. Representation that shows people as real people, not as tools for a plot, not as gimmicks, not as you say, somebody to pity, not as somebody that has to be inspirational. None of that, just a person who is disabled or is deaf, and how they interact with their life and how the things that happen to them unfold.
I do think there is a little bit of pressure on us, actually, as crime writers who feature disabled characters, because there aren't that many of us about, and because there aren't that many commercial fiction books in with what we're trying to do with just kind of ordinary disabled people or chronically ill people who just happen to be there. It feels so important that you really get it right. And I completely believe that you should represent all different kinds of people, all different kinds of personalities, so that disabled person doesn't have to be perfect. But I do struggle sometimes with just making sure that it is right. And I just wish there were so many more books about. So just as there are lots of portrayals of middle-aged white women doing lots of different things, then it wouldn't mean that somebody's read one book and think, oh, that's the way it is. That's the way it is for everybody, because it's not.
I think though that the more of us that write it, and I think the more people that push for that greater representation in publishing in general, and the people who are flagging it up and saying, look, this is important, as you're saying with your statistics, saying, look, this is important, 20% of people have a disability or a chronic illness, so surely 20% of our characters should have a disability or a chronic illness. If we're kind of pushing that, and then I think the more of us that do that, and the more often we do it, the more often we say it, the more it will happen, and the more that other people, particularly other disabled writers who are writing characters that they can identify with because they've not been able to find them, so they're writing them themselves, then I think it will hopefully give them more confidence to say, right, this is what I want to do, this is what I need to do, this is what, I can be part of this. So hopefully by us doing this, and of course you are involved in the setting up of the new prize for representation of disabled or chronically ill characters, aren't you?
I am, and just before I talk about that, I'd just like to add on something that I know. I'm in a Society of Authors group, a subgroup for authors with chronic illnesses and disabilities. And so there's a lot of people that feel the same way, but there's a lot of fear out there because there have been some setbacks and some barriers put in front of disabled authors in the past, such as, I mean, I'm going on anecdotal evidence from what people have told me, and also sort of my own concerns at the beginning, because I thought, I'm in a wheelchair and it is not easy. I am not able just to jump on a train and go to London to meet a publisher or an agent. So I did sort of wonder if that was going to count against me getting a deal, because there are, as you know now, there are far more people that want to be a novelist than there are actually book contracts. It's very competitive, and I thought, is that going to rule me out if somebody's got 2 books that they think are just as good? Is it hi-ho for me because of the way that I am? And I've also heard other authors in the past, and somebody actually quite recently, a very well-known best-selling author, be told by publishers, editors, not to put a disabled character in because they don't think they say, oh, it won't sell, people can't relate to it, it's too depressing. And my sort of reaction to that is, well, how do you know? Nobody's read it. How do you know? And, oh, it's too depressing, but it's okay to have books with serial killers in, stalking women and what have you, but not somebody in who's deaf or who is in a wheelchair or is neurodiverse or something. And I think some of those decisions have been made by editors who don't know anything about disability. It's completely out of their realm of their experience, and so they're making an assumption. But there is a great change now, which is really exciting, because more diverse agents and publishing staff are rising through the ranks, and it's really heartening to see. I know quite a few agents who actually put on their website that they're looking for diverse stories, they're looking for disabled authors, because they know there are so many brilliant stories to be told and that they're underrepresented. I think quite a few publishers as well have actually had calls out because they're looking, they know that they're behind, that there are all these stories to be told. Now, I think disability is a bit behind race and sexuality when it comes to featuring in fiction. We all obviously need to stand together, all the minorities together become the majority. But I do think disability and illness is playing a catch up a bit, but we are getting there.
Yeah, I think so. I think because obviously we come under the same kind of own voices umbrella. There's been quite a big push in publishing in general to say that, to talk about certain experiences, if you have an author who that is part of their lived experience, then listen to them, look at what they're writing, don't just give it to somebody else who hasn't lived that experience. And obviously that was talked a lot about in terms of race, in terms of the fact that publishing for a long time has been very middle class white, and so you'd have not many characters that weren't white, from whatever ethnic background or whatever racial or religious background. There were so few that weren't your middle class white, because that's what those are the writers who were becoming successful for all sorts of reasons. But now I think there is a more of a push. Obviously we don't have the balance yet. We don't have the same kind of proportion of writers of colour as we do have people of colour within the community. But it is increasing, and so that's something that obviously, as you say, we have to work together and we have to keep pushing, because of course somebody who is Black and disabled is more is suffering from more discrimination than that yourself and I are as white women. So we can help to bring other people's voices forward. We can accept the privilege that we have as well, alongside the get the balance, because we do have some privilege, both of us, but we don't have but we have other aspects that we are fall into a category where we're discriminated against. So I think, yeah, I think there are a lot of ways in which we can all support each other and all make sure that the publishing continues to change, because it's not changing very fast. And but as you say, there are a lot of people out there who are looking for writers who can write more diverse books, writers who are writing about something that is more about their lived experience, but just that will give people a wider view on the world, on things that they might not have experienced themselves.
Because
And
that's about what
because
literature is about, isn't it? It's about widening your view. It's about finding out about people and worlds that you don't know anything about, and then living through that through a novel. Disabled writers, we're not asking for special treatment. We're asking for equal treatment and for the barriers that have been there in our way to be removed. So we've got the equal chance as anybody else.
Yeah.
And actually, I find with the crime genre, it's really, really accepting. And within all the different sort of subgenres of crime, there's a lot of room to discuss things about society. Like we talked about race and gender and sexuality and things. I don't have a statistical survey, but I do feel that there's a lot more opportunity to discuss these issues in crime than there might be in other novels. And crime people, the crime writers, they're lovely people, aren't they? I've met quite so many, and you think, oh, crime writers, they're going to be a bit dodgy, they're going to be a bit murderous, a bit shifty. No, lovely people. It's just all about, we sort of explore the dark side in our work so we can have the happy side in our lives.
I do agree there that all the events that I've been to where you get a large number of crime writers together, it's, everybody does seem very welcoming and very friendly. And there are a few who are a bit like, I am very successful and I've published far more books than you, so I will not speak to you. But there's very few of them. I think in every kind of group of authors, you're going to get some of those. But there's very few of them, and everyone knows who they are, and people talk. So, like, I know a few. I haven't experienced that myself, but other authors have told me, so we just avoid them. So it's fine. But, there's so many others who are very friendly and very nice and very welcoming and very encouraging. And I really like going to Harrogate for that reason, because there's something about Harrogate where you do just mix with all sorts of different crime writers, and the really experienced kind of stalwarts of the crime community are there, and they're just so nice and so encouraging to those of us who are earlier on in our careers.
They recognize what they've been through as well. They know how difficult it is to grow your career, and everyone's just equal in that beer tent, aren't they?
There's I bet the bars do take some decent takings when crime writers get together. But that's because we sit up all night talking, so we buy more lemonades.
Earlier on, you asked me about the prize. You mentioned I was first published by a small indie called Red Door Press. My publisher, Claire Christian, I have a new publisher now. I'm now with Embla, which is part of Bonnier Books, but back then I was with Red Door, and my publisher, Claire Christian, she read my book and she just thought, oh wow, this is so refreshing, my perfect sister. Because I'd said in my submission letter that I wanted to have a disabled character in there, and but it's not about disability. And she just thought, why don't we see more of this? She's an ally, really. And she said to me, Penny, wouldn't it be great if there was a prize? Do you want to team up with me? So, not knowing anything about what it takes to set up a prize or all the money and all the work that goes into it, I went, yeah, why not? That's a really good idea. Let's be the people who make the change. And it took about 2 years, and we teamed up with the Society of Authors. We did a lot of work into finding supporters and trying to get some funding and all that. And then the prize was announced last year. It's been open to the first year of submissions. I'm one of the judges, and I've been really enjoying reading all the books. We've got a meeting this week, a judges meeting, me and the other 2 judges. So the people on the long list will be announced quite soon. The prize is called the ADCI Literary Prize, standing for authors with disabilities and chronic illnesses. And it's for adult novels. And the novelist, we ask that the novelist is disabled or chronically ill, but we don't ask for, you know, a doctor's note or anything like that. We trust you. Why would anybody really want to lie? And we can tell when you're writing anyway, because does it represent the community well or not? Or is it being written by somebody who doesn't have a clue? And it's across genres. There has been some crime entered, but also sort of literary, fantasy, sci-fi. And the point is just to shout out to the world how many great novelists are out there, to try and get them seen and read by more people, and for the industry and booksellers really to get more behind us and excited by it. July, I think it's July, is Disability Pride Month, and it's something that came over from America, and it's not as well supported here as it could be, and as are sort of other months for different groups, but it's gaining in popularity every year. And I would love to see shelves in bookstores in July with disabled authors, not just fiction, non-fiction, books about disability history, disability sport, whatever, all these things, just to celebrate all the people that there are in society and recognise them. I mean, one of the things why I think it's important to write, reasons why I think it's important to write disabled characters, is particularly for the people who can identify with that, because I know I grew up and I've always been an avid reader, not seeing anybody like myself in books, so not feeling really included in society. Or when I did see disabled characters there, I just thought, you know, it was one of those stereotypes. And I do remember, I think I'd been about 10 or 11 and I'd had an operation. I was in hospital. I was sort of like a day or so afterwards. I was reading The Secret Garden, and there's a character in there, I don't quite remember his name now, but he's a wheelchair user, and then he makes some friends, and whoa, he can walk. And me thinking, is that going to happen to me? And then thinking, well, no, of course not. It's not. That's not real life. And then as I read on and found out what happened to that character in the end, thinking, well, I'm glad that's not me. But there was nothing to show a different side of it, to celebrate sort of young people being the way that they were. It was all about disability being a tragedy. And I wanted to read something like, I don't know if you know, but I loved like Enid Blyton, Mallory Towers, things like that when I was a certain age. And I wanted to read stories about somebody in a wheelchair who played lacrosse, you know, and was going for midnight feast and was just having fun with friends and wasn't seen as different, or wasn't an issue. I'm actually working on a children's book now that's kind of what I wanted to read when I was a child. And then as an adult, you know, things portrayal, it hasn't got much better. It's actually improving a lot with children's literature, I think. But we're still not there yet with adult literature. There's one particular book. Do you want to say anything about that we've talked about before? The one that particularly made the community quite angry.
Which one? I'm sorry, my mind's a blank. Which one? I know we've had this conversation several times in events before, haven't we?
I don't want to actually say the writer, because I don't think.
Oh yeah, just talk about
lots of other good books, but it had a disabled character in who commits suicide. And what I was saying earlier on about if there were loads and loads of portrayals, then committing suicide, it wouldn't really matter. or it would just be a different representation. But when there aren't any, people
Yes.
take that as the disabled experience.
Yeah, and because the suicide was because they didn't wish to be a burden as well, and that just reinforces so many stereotypes, the idea that disabled people are a burden, instead of being, regular people who are trying to go about their lives, in the best way they can with the barriers that are put in front of them, and trying to get through normal life whilst also overcoming barriers that are put in front of them, whether physical or metaphorical or emotional or whatever. Yes, and so yeah, that was certainly a harmful situation, because, as you say as well, it was such a big book, it was so popular. It's been made into a film. Is it a film as well? Yeah. And yes, it is. Yeah, that this is why it's so important to have so many more representations, and such a wide range of things, because imagine if you, as like a 13-year-old, had read that book, what effect could that have had on your mental health, and your portrayal of your kind of like vision of yourself,
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what do you think, Nell? We've said we think more disabled people should be in crime novels. What do you think about people who don't have a disability writing disabled characters?
I think if they think about what they're doing, I don't think there's anything wrong with that, because I mean, I've written characters of different races from myself, different ethnic backgrounds and different nationalities and things like that. I've written male characters, I've written point of view male characters, and I think as long as you know in your mind, okay, this is not my direct experience, so I need to do it right, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But I do think that if the publisher has a choice between a book written, or two very similar books about disabled people, one written by a disabled writer and one written by a non-disabled writer, they do then have to look and think, right, well, which one is the more accurate representation? And it might be that the one written by the non-disabled writer is a much better book, but then you need to have a look and say, right, well, what does the disabled writer need as support in order to help them write a better book? I think it's something that there's nothing wrong with people writing things outside of their experience, because if we didn't do that, we'd have no historical fiction, we'd have no fantasy or sci-fi. There are so many things that we wouldn't have that are wonderful, wonderful books, wonderful stories, and the same with film and TV, if we didn't go outside of our own experience. But you have to make sure that you think about what you're doing, and you don't just throw a character in there thinking, oh yeah, I need a disabled character in here, in they go, without learning anything about their disability. And it's like, if you stick a wheelchair user in, well, so many people who use wheelchairs have so many different conditions, whether they're illnesses, whether they're disabilities, whether they were born with them, whether they were in an accident, or whether an illness, it was a progressive illness or something like that. You need to know why your character is a wheelchair user, and what their life experience has been, and how that's affected them, and how that has affected how other people treat them, and things like that. So it's not just about saying, oh, I'm going to stick this character in a wheelchair, or, oh, this character, I've decided they've got a limb difference, so they don't have a right hand. And it's like, well, you have to read up on that. You have to talk to people who have experienced that, or go online and find a community of people who are willing to at least tell you a few of their experiences. Don't go online on a message board and take people's experiences without letting them know that's what you're doing. I've known of authors who do that, who have done that. I have hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which I can't say very fast. And I am in a couple of Facebook groups related to that, and I've had somebody join. I've known of somebody join a group because they were doing a university study. So they didn't have EDS themselves. They joined the group because they wanted to find out about people's experiences, but they didn't tell people before they did it. And they just read through people's posts, and then afterwards said, oh, these are all going to be really useful for my research, thanks. As you can imagine, there was a massive uproar, because groups like that are a safe space for people to talk about issues, and sometimes just a vent, and to talk about quite personal medical things sometimes. And so for somebody who doesn't have that experience themselves to come in and say, I'm just going to cherry pick what I want from here. Yeah, so if you want to find out about a particular condition or illness or disability or whatever, then if you're talking to people about it, be upfront and say, I am an author, I am writing a character with X, Y, and Z, and I want to make sure they're authentic. Can I ask you some questions? In most cases, people will say, yes, or ask me some questions. And if the questions are too personal, then hopefully they will say, not answering that, you can look that up. But most people, I think, if you are authentic and you say, I'm trying to make sure this character is as true to life as possible, then I think most people would at least be willing to give you a bit of time, to talk about things. But as I say, just be honest about it.
I agree. I think the key thing is to do your research. Like you, I have characters, religions, ethnicities that are not my own. But the key thing is not to fall back on stereotypes, I think, to really make sure to do your research, make sure you're authentically representing that group. I don't think that I would probably have a main character that was totally out of my experience, unless it was fantasy. I was just sort of completely making it up. I don't think, say, for example, my lead character would be a Somali refugee. I think that perhaps there would be somebody else that could tell that story better than me. But yeah, I think, like we've been saying earlier, we live in a very diverse society, and those people need to appear in our modern day set novels, because it's weird if they don't. And also, yeah, so I've written people of ethnicities that aren't my own. I've also written characters who can run from birth, who don't have a disability, and I've never been able to do that. I just make it up. That's what novelists do. Use your imagination.
Yeah. As you say, I mean, it's about thinking, is this an important part of my book? Is this an important part of this character? And it has to be, yes, this is part of who this character is, not just because I think I need to tick a quota in my book. And you did say a very, very kind of pertinent thing there, saying, am I the best person to write this? And I think that's, if there's a non-disabled writer who is wanting to write a disabled character, then that is the question that they need to ask themselves. So if it is a main character and the book is about their disability or about their illness, then you think, well, are you the best person to write that? And if you still think you are, fair enough. But if you think, well, actually, maybe there's a different story I could tell, and that character could be part of it, but that's not necessarily their life, and their experience is not necessarily the story. They're part of a wider story. That's I think the nuance.
I've got an author friend who has a sister with a particular learning disability, and she's written a story with a character with that disability as one of the main characters, and this woman's a disability ally, and she knows all about it because of her sister, and she's very close to her. So that's great, I think. But it's just if you are just reaching for something out of the blue that you don't have any kind of connection with, and you haven't done any research.
Yeah.
Right, I think we're coming up to question time. Gail.
I've just seen that, yeah.
Hello. Hi.
Hi.
Been some really good chat on the YouTube for this one. Just to mention, Nell, you mentioned not having read many deaf characters. One of the ones that I've read that I actually think represented the deaf community very well, and I have to say I think it did, but I'm not deaf and I'm not disabled, so I could be totally wrong, was For the Sake of Elena, one of the Inspector Linley books from Elizabeth George. And that was written back, I think, in the early 90s. And it had a very good representation of the community as a whole there.
You know what, I actually have that on my Kindle, and I've had it for quite some time after, because I've written a Crime Reads article about novels with deaf characters. and that was on my shortlist, but I didn't have time to read it because by the time I had to write the article, so it's been sitting there and I've just not got around to reading it. I will read it at some point. But yes, that's a good one. The book that I actually mentioned was A Maiden's Grave by Jeffrey Deaver. I realized I didn't actually say which book it was, but that's a book where a bus carrying students and staff from a school for deaf children is involved in like a hostage situation, and so that's a very interesting one, and it is the community from the school who are all deaf, and then there's one of the deaf staff who ends up kind of interacting with the hostage negotiator, which is very interesting.
Yeah, that does sound interesting. There's quite a bit of commentary on the chat, and one of the questions here is, do you think that some disabilities are more acceptable to be found in novels than others? The lady who asked, which is Helen, I believe, and I apologise if it's Louise. I have a chronic illness, IBD, and can't think of a novel that has a character with IBD. I can't think of one either, but can you ladies?
No, but that is a very good question. I think that the aspects of any disability or chronic illness that deal with bodily functions, I think that is something that would be harder to get past a publisher. I absolutely believe that there should be the representation, things like IBD or things like endometriosis or anything like that that deals with things that people don't tend to talk about.
I actually wrote a short
Absolutely.
story about endometriosis, and it's in my short story collection, the last cut casebook.
There you go. But no, I do think that's important. I can't think of anything off the top of my head either that talks about those. I suppose because in novels it's rare for people to actually talk about their characters' bodily functions. Like in a crime novel, you don't normally talk about when the detective goes to the toilet, or if you're a detective, if a period starts in the middle of a case, or things like that. But I do think it's something that is worth examining and thinking, well, we need to be more comfortable with talking about these things in order for the people with these conditions to feel more comfortable in themselves, in their lives, and talking to their friends and family about them, even talking to medical personnel, because things like that, people often avoid going to the doctor about things because they're embarrassed, because people don't talk about bodily functions like that. But it is so important that we do.
So do you think there's certain ones that are more acceptable as writers?
I think that we could open this up to a wider issue. So it's not just about being acceptable as writers. It's things that are more societally acceptable, that people who don't have a disability can understand more. So it might be somebody who's been in an accident and is in a wheelchair, like somebody can get their head around that more than they can perhaps somebody born with cerebral palsy or cystic fibrosis. They don't understand it, and something might, how can I put it, sort of challenge their view of somebody. So I just remembered the comedian Rosie Jones went on Question Time and received loads of trolling for the way that she spoke and the fact that the way her body was, which was totally disgraceful. And I suppose those people didn't think it was as acceptable as if she was a disabled person who'd had a hidden disability. And so that was something that you didn't know, and she just looked the same as other women. So it could
I think as well with Rosie Jones, it's that the sort of people who are trolling her, they don't like a disabled woman speaking up for herself.
Yeah,
I think there's that aspect as well, that there are certain people who think that people with disabilities should just hide themselves away in a corner and not put themselves out there. And
that's not right.
Exactly, and I think that's part of that as well. And so that's part of the reason why we need more of it in fiction.
I've noticed as well that there are now quite a few disabled comedians, so hopefully that will spread into wider society.
Exactly. And in publishing, when we're talking about representation of different conditions in novels, the editors are the gatekeepers. So it might be that the editors think, well, I don't think somebody wants to read about somebody with irritable bowel syndrome or
Yeah.
incontinence or bowel cancer, something like that. Oh, it's going to put people off, so just strike it out, change it to
Yeah.
something. So what we need is more people writing those stories, because if you write a jolly good story, then it should hopefully get published. And we need editors and publishers to widen their thinking a bit and not just assume that people aren't going to read it, because how do they know if a book's not
Exactly.
like that? They don't know. It could be the next hit and they're actually missing out on lots of cash.
Yeah, Jenny D asks a good question on that. She says, how do you find publishing / editing process if you're traditionally published? She says she's blind and has been told to not to disclose this to agents in case she's considered too difficult to work with, which I think is, someone telling her that seems just disgraceful to me.
I think if any agent who is worth approaching would have absolutely no problem with that, because any agent who told you or who felt that you were too difficult to work with is not worth working with. I will say that, because
And also going against code of conduct as well.
It's breaching the 2020 Equality Act, but never mind about that. Yes, I think any decent agent, any agent who's worth being with, will take any writing on the face of it. If you write well, they don't care if you're blind, if you're disabled, if what your background is. If you write well, I think there has been a lot of gatekeeping in the past, but I think nowadays the majority of certainly younger agents, a lot of the kind of bigger agents working now. I mean, my agent, who is arguably one of the best in the business, she knows that I want to write a book with a character with EDS, and she has encouraged me to do that, because she knows that I want to do that, because that's something that I have experienced, and she actively encourages me to do that. So good. I think anyone who's worth being represented by would not say that, and they might find certain things challenging when you're working with whatever software you need in order to edit things, but again, any decent agent or any decent editor will find a way around that.
Yeah,
I would advise to look on agents' websites, because many now actually say that they're open, they welcome submissions from people with a disability or an illness. And I think it's really important. I know I can completely understand the sort of fear of discrimination, but it's really important to be upfront and honest, because they can't meet your needs if you don't tell them what they are. And if they expect something from you and you can't do it because of your needs, then that's only just going to make you feel awful and affect that relationship with them. So just be open and honest. There is a document that you can produce called an access rider. If you Google it, it means, and on there you can actually write down what your access needs are in a sort of dispassionate way. And so if you don't feel comfortable just actually talking about it, you can say, look at my access rider. This means that this will show you what my needs are. So I don't know, you might have a different software or what have you. And so, for example, I have chronic fatigue and I don't work in the mornings. And so that's what I tell people up front, so they know they're not going to expect me to have a meeting at 9 o'clock, and they know that I can't just jump on a train, and they know I've got a hearing aid. So I want to have Zoom meetings rather than phone calls, because it helps to lip read. So if you just tell them up front, I think the vast majority of agents will be very welcoming and learn. You've got to accept that they might need time to learn how to do it. They might not pick it all up straight away, but they will learn. And if an agent doesn't want to, well, then they aren't the agent for you. You are not going to have a productive working relationship for them. And perhaps they might be actually really difficult with people who don't have a disability as well.
Maybe you ought to decide that they're not good enough for you rather than them deciding that they're not good enough for you. For them.
Absolutely, yeah.
But you're
Yes.
paying them. Agents get a portion of the money you earn. You're paying them. So they wouldn't exist if it wasn't for your work. So
we've only got a couple of minutes. Well, actually, we're nearly out of time. But one thing I want to pick up, Louise has said, writing a novel and using my own experience for how others perceive my conditions. I'm putting these experiences into characterizations. Do you have any tips to add for this idea?
Oh, that's a tricky one. I think making sure that you are staying authentic to what you want to write and don't feel like you have to put certain things in. Don't feel like, oh, maybe I really should mention that. If you don't want to, then don't. But if it's important, an important part of the story, then make sure it's in there. I would say, I mean, there are stories that are specifically about a person with a disability or an illness and that kind of experience, that arc of their lifetime, perhaps. And if it's a story like that, then obviously you need a lot of detail in. But if it's a story that happens to have a disabled character, then make sure you're not overloading the reader with too much information at once about the illness or disability, and make sure it's woven in to the story, into what's actually happening to that person. So it's not just about who they are, but it's about what's happening around them and how they're responding to it as well.
Yeah, and I'd say look after your own kind of mental health. Don't feel that you have to put in, as Nell said, all of your experiences or have to make that character you, because that could be a bit triggering. It's still fiction, unless it's memoir, of course. And just adhere to all the basic rules of storytelling, which is having your characterization, having light and shade, and not putting something in there because it's issue based when it isn't relevant to the story. So, I mean, it's quite good actually to share your work with other writers who might have had the same experience, because they can just give you a bit of sort of supportive feedback on if there's any areas that you might need to work on.
Lovely. Right, thank you both. It's been wonderful listening to you, and also thank you to those watching. This is the last of the live events for the Gwyl Crime Cymru Festival. So, diolch, thank you, and we hope to see you again soon. Good night.
Thank you.